Hi, my name is James McNab, and I'm the General Manager at Totem. Welcome back. We're going to have another conversation between Paul and I. Paul's our Director of Editorial and Creative at Totem, and we're going to have a little conversation about why a brand would want to do content. So this conversation applies to print programs for sure, but it also applies to any kind of digital content programs, any kind of social or video programs, any kind of ongoing publishing activity a brand is involved in over time. And we wanted to give a little bit of thought to why people should engage with this sort of thing. It's kind of a fundamental, and we thought we should explore it a little bit because it's not that straightforward. It's not a typical marketing tactic. It does not have an immediate ROI, but it can have an immediate influence on how people feel about your brand. So we wanted to start to talk about that, unpack it, and look at a couple recommendations as to how you can approach it as a brand or as a company. So there is one big reason why you would want to engage with content marketing, or I should say publishing in general, and I'll give that away right now, and that has to do with an alignment between your brand's values and your customers. At the end of the day, it really ties into that. There's a lot of other peripheral benefits, but if you can get to some kind of overlap between your values and expressing them in a manner that aligns to your customers, they're going to be influenced by you, and they're going to have a different feeling about your brand, and that's what you're really after at the end of the day. And I actually think it ties a lot into the virtues a brand is pursuing or wants to represent, more so than just the values. And I will get into that a little bit later. First, I kind of want to differentiate different parts of content marketing. Obviously, content marketing has been through quite a few different cycles in the last few years, and I would define three different groups. The first group I would talk about is kind of like content marketing, so traditionally content marketing, and this is email programs, direct mail programs, anything that's got a performance marketing bent to it. And I would say that those performance marketing tactics are really about how do we change the headline, how do we change the offer, the call to action, what kind of material or information do we provide. Some of the larger scale digital content solutions for websites will even do analysis over if we present this content first, we get a higher click-through rate, or we get a better close rate if they see this information first and that information second, and they'll do those kinds of multivariate analysis in the background and dynamically serve things up based on who the user is. And all of that is really performance optimization. And it's an interesting space, not what we do. No. And there's been a number of companies that have really built themselves up on doing kind of email newsletters and information, especially in the B2B space, where it's had a lot of traction. But I actually think that's all performance marketing. It's not really about the content. It's about optimizing the material to increase your click-through rates and increase your conversions. So very, very direct kind of like end of funnel kind of activity.
Right.
The next one, I'm sure you've seen this one as well, I want to talk about is kind of like content advertising. So this is where a company will say it's content marketing, but it's really executed typically through an ad agency, and it's tied into all of the media. And the one I was thinking about, so unfortunately we have a McDonald's downstairs, and I eat there more often than I'd like to admit. And I was in there, there was more material on their display screens today, and that's what kind of got me thinking about this, but they've had this long-term kind of food origins story, and it's about, you know, all of the rumors. Like when I was a kid, my dad used to say, "Oh, the McDonald's milkshakes, they're thickened with sawdust," right? And I obviously total nonsense. But everything from like, is 100% pure beef? Is that a company? Or is that a fact? And so they've collected a lot of these kinds of questions and rumors. They solicited them through social media. They captured a lot of them. So it really comes off as like a user-generated content program. And they have a big database of this material. They've got a website that presents it all. And what they've really done is they've exposed it kind of in little windows of it over time through to, say, a little bit of social, like billboards, on-screen, radio. When it all launched, it was a pretty big deal. And they led the headlines with some of the more challenging questions that they received. And that's, I think, again, that's a content-centered activity, but it's really focused on advertising. And although there certainly is an activity in the background of kind of curating the right content and developing that, again, that's very much like a campaign-driven activity. Again, not really what we do.
No, but it is a good example of kind of an overall shift within the grander marketing sphere, where an ad agency typically would have done ad campaigns in their various guises, but has gotten into a content program. and you're right, it's not necessarily something that lives in a magazine or on a platform. However, it is content. It is telling a bigger story, which is, there's parts of that are obviously what we do,
yeah.
But it is a good example of how the worlds continue to blend and blur and morph into the bigger world of content.
And I guess you do end up with a sense of a narrative over time, and that is a good thing.
Yeah.
But it's not really editorial per se.
No, not at all. No.
In fact, a good digression to talk a little bit about editorial in the sense that I had the opportunity to start working at Post Media back when it was CanWest. I was there over that transition to Post Media. It was an interesting education for me because I came from a digital background, did a lot of user-centered design, and it struck me that the content being produced was not user-centered. It was editorial-centered.
Right.
It isn't the job of the audience to tell the editor what matters. I mean, there is certainly a sense that the editor needs to know what matters and what they should be talking about. But it really was very much about the sense that the editor's job is to tell the audience what's important. And that was a bit of a shift in my head for how that can work. And it's obviously not as cut and dried as that, but it was certainly, you go from a place that really was focused on usability and crafting the designs of systems to work really well with consumers, to a place that says, hey, it's our job to tell people what matters. And you're like, well, hang on a second. What makes you the boss? Well, that's the difference. An editor's job is to really have that sense.
And the editors and the reporters on the ground are the ones who are kind of leading that decision. The editor then gets to choose from those stories that are coming back saying, here's all the things we found out. What's the hierarchy? What's the most important thing? How should we play these things? And I think, if you fast forward from that time to now, editorial teams in newspapers in any kind of media environment have a lot more ways to figure out what people are going to pay attention to, what they're interested in.
The work that we do is editorial, and one of the fundamental differentiators from any of these other things is it isn't necessarily about the product or the brand or the service that your business offers. It is about other stories that are tied in with it in some interesting ways. And traditionally, this work falls under the guise of kind of custom content. Of course, that's a bit of an antiquated term, but fundamentally, a lot of the work we do still is in that. That term is associated with magazines, and we do a lot of magazines, but the same practice applies across other media as well. So it's a bit of an interesting game. It's a place where you try to find out what content you can produce that's going to be representative of a brand's interests and also ties into the interests of the consumer. And I think mapping that out is part of the challenge of journalism. But ultimately, this content has to be provided by the brand itself. So it will be packaged and presented and sent by the brand to the consumer, to their customers, under the guise of like a loyalty or a membership program. And it kind of comes off as added value, but I don't think that's why it matters. And I kind of want to bounce a few things off you and then ask you some key questions around like, how do we get at that stuff? Because that is really the practice of journalism. And journalism is not necessarily what we do, but it's our core tool. Would you say that's fair?
It's a core skill set, yeah. I mean, like we were saying before, I wouldn't want to classify the work we do as journalism because it is in the service of a brand. It is using journalistic tools, that's fair to say.
Yeah.
And we do tend to work with people who have a journalism background in some fashion, who at least know how to go out there and find stories and write stories and pitch ideas. But yeah, it's using those tools in like I said, in the service of a brand and finding the way to tell a story that will still be engaging to a reader the same way a magazine or newspaper journalist would.
And the question then becomes, what about your product, your brand, or your service? Do your customers care about the way that's expressed? So if I'm interested in mountain biking, I'm going to have a particular sense of things that matter to me about mountain biking. And it might be the toughness of things. It might be the speed or the pace or the excitement, whatever it is. And those are the things that matter. So I don't necessarily need more articles on mountain bike parts. But maybe I do care about where I bike, what it feels like, how that bike brings that to life, and the whole experience of mountain biking.
Or you might want to know how the bike is built and have a story on a guy who builds the bike for the company, who's the master craftsman, the frame builder or something along those lines, who says, here's how the welds, here's how I do this, here's how this all comes together, here's the stuff I use, here's the tools that I use to make this the product that you want. And then, yes, if you are concerned about, okay, well, I don't know how tough this bike is, you're not going to be told the bike is tough because of this and this. You're going to be told by showing, but someone is showing you the story of how it's made. That's a good way to get that across.
So like toughness was one of those things I was after. There's ways to express that, and that creates a domain that where you have this, this sense of what are the attributes of the brand, how do they overlap with what the customer's values are? Because what you really want is you want that end consumer to have this sense of connection, the sense of this brand cares about what I care about. We have a common bond, and as long as they keep doing that, and I keep caring about these things, then their products and the experience that brings to me are going to matter.
Right.
And I think that's really what custom content or a content publishing program can bring to life that you really can't get across through just the design of the product, facts about the product, or the marketing or the website, and this kind of like narrow set of structures that hold up that customer to brand relationship. And that's the space that I think is often missing in the absence of these kinds of programs. I want to ask a couple of questions about how do you go find those stories? What are some of the best stories you've told, and why were they identified as those stories?
There are certain things that brands would care about and certain priorities they have. So we would take a look at, what's important to them. Is it if you're talking about bikes, you're talking about cars, you're talking about food. Is it the fact that food is sourced locally? Just off the top of my head, the food comes from reliable sources. The mountain bikes are tough and they're able to withstand anything. So these are things we take a look at, and then from there you pull those seeds of those bigger priorities or ideas and say, okay, well, like the previous example I mentioned with the mountain bike, you could show the guy who makes it. It's always, as an aside, it's always good to put a human face to some of this as much as possible, because that helps to tell the story, because people love to read about other people. If you're concerned about understanding the quality of something, if you have someone talking about it and someone who's passionate about it and someone who knows their stuff, then that's a great way to help to get them, to talk to them, to interview them, do a Q&A, do a video with them talking about their product or the thing that they work on for that brand and how passionate they are about it. People relate to that kind of stuff. So it does go back to what are every journalist has been trained to ask the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, why, for any story. And you start to ask that of the brand. What are the things that it stands for, and where are those little threads we can pull to start making stories? And then you can tell those stories in a variety of ways. Some of them will lend themselves to video, some will lend themselves to print, some will lend themselves to social media. So there's a variety of ways you can tell the story. But that's really how, if you're lucky enough to have kind of an exploratory phase with any brand at the start of any project, that's the opportunity to do that stuff. And then you can pull out what the priorities are, and you can kind of map those things out, and you have a variety of tools to do that. You can plan those things out for a couple of years if you like, or for whatever period of time you have. But that's the kind of the overall the best way to start.
So really you're taking those kind of core journalistic activities, and to answer the questions about the brand attributes or characteristics, you're simply turning that device and pointing it at the brand and saying, what matters here? And you point at the customers and the world aside, and you say, what matters there? And that creates your domain where you can work. And then inside there, it's, again, identifying, like you said, those key elements that you can pull on and looking at what you could potentially talk about as a result.
Yeah, and when you find those key elements, you do have to make sure you're rationalizing that and explaining that to the people involved, if it's the marketing people, explaining where that kind of connection is. So if you have, here's a person who's the maker of this particular product, or however, how does that relate back to the core attributes of the brand? Well, here's how you tell that story. And that's where, that's something that might not be visible to the consumer, but it's certainly visible to the marketing people to say, okay, I get that, that makes sense. So you do have to make those connections back, but that's really where it all starts.
But what are those 2, 3 key standout stories, and how did you arrive at telling those stories? Obviously, we're talking about things that have been published already.
Yes, we've like I said, we've been fortunate to work in travel and automotive, are two very lively, dynamic areas of content. Like we said, rich in people and obviously destinations, all kinds of things, technology, all that kind of stuff is kind of in both travel and automotive. How do we arrive at them? In some cases, they're ideas that we have developed ourselves, we being the editorial team. I can't take credit for that. I have a team who does all this, but I think that sometimes we'll look at a priority. Maybe it's to, for example, with one of our clients, the story might be about travel to a far-flung location, or a trip of a lifetime kind of idea. And sometimes it could be specific as we want to promote this area of the world. We want to have a story that promotes our travel offering to Antarctica. So, okay, we can do that. So in that case, and we did, and we've done it. So I think in that case, that became a priority from the brand. And that was passed to us. In between that, us executing the story and the priority over here is the finding the writer who has a journalism background, who can tell that story and who can find the angle and who can weave an interesting piece about going on a tour to this particular area. So that's certainly a highlight for us to be able to tell that story, because it is a place that people don't necessarily get to go regardless, and it's such a cool destination to write about.
The other thing I think that's worth talking about is the fact that this is a long-term endeavor. Yes. So you don't get to do like one issue of a magazine. That's not a program, or one group of web articles you publish and that's it. It has to be something that happens over time. We did a study a number of years ago, and this is going back far enough I can safely talk about this without a client's name on it, where we studied the impact of a magazine that was a twice annual magazine going off into the US market. It went to about 1 million people. And we did a tracking study. Well, we didn't actually do the tracking study. It was done by a third party, so it was actually legit. It wasn't just us doing the analysis ourselves, saying, "Hey, look, we're awesome." But it was MRI Research in the U.S. who did the actual work, the heavy lifting. They had a holdback group, so we had a statistically significant sample to allow us to look at what really was the impact of this. And over a 4-year tracking study, we were able to determine that somebody who received the magazine over 4 contacts or 2 years became significantly profitable relative to the cost of producing the magazine, in that they could track that they were getting, I think, $7 more per household per year, and it was costing them about $1 a magazine. So you can imagine the ROI was significant, and that was based on really an analysis of the profit, not just the revenue generated. So these programs, even if they move the needle just like a little bit, over a high enough number of people over a long enough period of time, if a company's committed to it as a brand vehicle, it will move the needle. So, but the challenge there, of course, is you have to decide that you're involved in a longer term program.
Right.
And we've been very fortunate to work with a number of clients that do exactly that sort of thing, and that's why they come to us. Anybody can go hire a journalist once and get an article written and published on their website. That's a very different thing from running an ongoing program, which is constantly in development. I mean, you plan content a year in advance in a lot of cases with some of our main clients. So it's not something where we're dealing with, hey, next week let's go do this thing.
Right. And I think there has to be there has to be a commitment, because, like I said, especially on a magazine, because there's still discussions around, the existence of print and whether that still matters, and to a lot of people it still does. There's things like magazine frequency. Like I said, one magazine is not going to move the needle. One magazine goes into the ether and never comes back. However, if you're committing to that, you're going to fine tune it to make sure you have a decent cadence. If it's quarterly, for example, if it's monthly, you have to commit to that, and then you have to track it. So you can do all the work, create these great stories. You have to make sure that people are reading them, and you have to gauge what they're going after. And it goes back to your earlier point when we were talking about the kind of the push-pull of media in general. You have people who are, yes, sending the stories out into the world, but you do have to track them and make sure that those people the people you want to read them are actually in fact reading them.
Okay, so let me summarize and kind of wrap up the conversation. We've explored a lot of territory here related to doing a content program and content marketing in general. I've got kind of 5 key things. First thing is to know what your brand stands for. Second thing is know what matters to your customers.
Right.
It's not really about you, it's about the material that is being created. And yes, you can wrap marketing material in there, you can put some direct offers in there, and it is a marketing vehicle, it's a brand vehicle. So I think that understanding that in the domain that you carve out to say this is what we're going to talk about, that space has to be something that is naturally influenced by the brand or naturally fits with the brand. So you're not fighting between 2 different things. And then you have to realize it's a long-term engagement. You are going to generate results if you stick with it. You can't do it for a year and hope that everything goes well after 1 or 2 issues. You have to do something significant over time. And I would always encourage you to measure that properly using a third-party research company or using services of a research team that is at least independent from your editorial team. And then finally, do something exceptional. Don't do a repeat of something else. I can't not say it. I was sitting in a meeting not that many years ago with a senior person at a grocery store company. And they said, well, we want to become the destination for recipes on the internet. And I smiled and said, well, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. But the reality is there are already enough destinations. We don't need another website with a pile of recipes. That's not an open territory. That's not new. That's not differentiated. Find something that will differentiate your brand and do that instead. And do something that nobody else has done. That's a tall order, but it's worth doing if you can get it right. So that's our conversation this week. We're going to follow on with a series of other topics and other people and interviews. Hopefully this has been informative, and thank you for watching to the very end. We'll see you again next week.